All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. As we know, Holy Week's a tough time, so we're really grateful for you being here. And we're looking forward to sharing the recording for those folks that can't be here. If I can just ask you to please make sure to remember, as you are doing, to mute your microphones during our presentation this afternoon. On behalf of the Jesuit School Network's conference office, welcome to our latest virtual Ignatian inquiry session. The JSN seeks to be a supportive resource to our schools, and its virtual session is designed to be just that, a carved out space to listen, to learn, and to engage. We are eager to encourage a spirit of inquiry across the many layers of our work in Jesuit education, and we envision our particular brand of Ignatian inquiry to be the art of inquiry as seen through our Ignatian lens, asking questions and exploring issues that matter in our schools through the frame of our shared Jesuit mission. For those that I don't know, I am Kristen Ross Kelly. I serve as Director of Educational Inquiry with the JSN Conference Office, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Kristen Smith, who leads all things communication for us, who is here on the Zoom and will help us enjoy what we imagine to be a seamless Zoom session together. If we can begin, as we do, just take a moment to start with a prayer. If I can ask us to quiet ourselves and be reminded that in being together, we are in the presence of God. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I'm so grateful to my colleague at the JSN, Catherine Steffens, for this prayer from a recent edition of Hemispheres. A prayer for our earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Saint Ignatius, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And of course, that is from Laudato Si. Again, I welcome you this afternoon to our virtual Ignatian inquiry session entitled Caring for Our Common Home by Learning from Integral Ecology, Coral Reef Fisheries in the Face of Climate Change. Around 13% of the world's population depends on coral reefs, but these crucial ecosystems are threatened by climate change, overfishing, and pollution. Bryan Galligan will share his experiences working with coral reef dependent communities in East Africa as they confront the effects of this planetary crisis. After discussing what climate change looks like for these frontline communities, Bryan will show how integral ecology provides a framework for action using his own research as a case study. We know this session will be of interest to all those who support the mission of Jesuit education and seek greater insight into animating the Universal Apostolic Preferences in their school communities. It's my pleasure to introduce Bryan Galligan. He is a Jesuit of the USA East Province in formation for the priesthood, currently studying theology at Boston College. Bryan's academic research focuses on coral reef fisheries ecology. His recent publications explore ways to maintain ecological function while producing increased nutrient yields for human consumption in East Africa and the West Indian Ocean. He has also written about ocean governance and policy from a justice perspective. As a research and policy analyst at the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network, Africa, in Nairobi, Kenya, Bryan led the network's global environmental advocacy and research agenda from 2021 to 2023. In addition to research and publication, this work also included engaging with food and climate negotiations at the United Nations, providing capacity building on environmental governance for faith-based actors, and supporting collaboration among Jesuit social and ecology institutions in Africa. It's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Bryan.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And thank you for having me. It is just great to be here and to share about these things that are really important to me and really important to us as people who carry this Ignatian identity and do this work together. Give me 1 second and I will share my screen and we'll get going. How's this? Are we good? The screen share is working? Awesome, thank you. That's great visual feedback. So I'm here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I did in Kenya and continue to do around integral ecology and tropical seascapes. My hope is that for you as educators and people involved in education, you can learn from really the models that I'm putting into practice and begin to think critically about how you might appropriate those same models in your work. And those models I'm referring to are really, it's integral ecology. That's what I'm talking about. And that's the first phrase in this little title here. Just really quickly, integral ecology is the framework proposed to us by Pope Francis in his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si as really the way that we are to respond to the planetary crisis. And we'll talk about later on a little bit about more specifically what integral ecology means, how it can be something you do, not just something you talk about. But we're going to really stick within my own context or the context of my work, which is this context of tropical seascapes. And Kristen really helpfully talked about my work on coral reef fisheries. That's really a shorthand for the fisheries that take place in these seascapes. You can see in this picture here, these waves breaking over this coral reef. But it's not just coral that we're talking about, although the coral are really important, and we will spend time talking about them. If you look past where the waves are breaking on the right side of this picture, you see this kind of sandy lagoon area and all those kind of green spots are vegetation, that's seagrass. And all these really important habitats work together in the tropics, specifically in East Africa and the Western Indian Ocean, which is really the specific social and ecological context for what we'll be talking about today. So let's dive right in and talk a little bit about coral reefs. So we'll begin with this kind of more global view of some of the challenges that we're facing with coral reefs, the fishers and communities that depend on them, and what climate change is causing. I want you to get a sense of what that looks like for communities. So I have some videos from interviews we did in Kenya, and you'll be able to hear from some frontline communities. And then finally, we'll close by talking about my own research and how I've worked to put integral ecology into action in a way that hopefully you will also be able to do after listening to this talk and kind of thinking about some of the things I'll propose to you. So just to begin, it's really important to remember that coral reefs are not just pretty ecosystems. They're incredibly important to around 13% of the world's population. So over 1 billion people around the world rely on coral reefs for food, for tourism dollars, for income from fishing, and from all kinds of things we can't quantify with money, which in many ways are more important. For a lot of the communities that I worked with, really their individual and social well-being is really just profoundly tied up with the ecological well-being of their ecosystems. And for us in the global north, it's really easy to think about that as a marginal perspective or something that's, an exception to the rule, when in fact, if you look at the numbers, over 1 billion people we are the exception to the rule here in the global north um, in terms of reliance on local ecosystems. So coral reefs are important, but they're under threat. And you know this, I know you know this from the news. You've probably heard about this phenomenon of coral bleaching. And coral bleaching is just what you see in front of you. Um, it's where you have, so corals basically are, what we talk about as corals are really two organisms. It's the actual colony of coral polyps, which are those structures you see on the right, the physical structures. And inside those polyps live these tiny algae called zooxanthellae. They're what give coral their color, and they're photosynthetic. They're like little plants, right? So they turn sunlight energy into chemical energy into food, both for themselves, but also for the coral polyps. So they have this really nice, friendly, symbiotic relationship. But the problem is that environmental stress disrupts that relationship. And that's caused by heat. It's also caused by sunlight radiation. It's also caused by pollution and various other environmental conditions. So it really is exacerbated and accelerated by climate change, but it is not just about heat. It's really a very complicated set of stressors that causes coral bleaching. So basically, when the corals are under stress, they eject those little microalgae, they eject their zooxanthellae, and then if they have to do that for too long, they starve to death, and you get they will eventually die, and that's what's going on the left here. When corals die, it's not just sad because the corals are dead, but because this incredibly complex and biodiverse ecosystem that supports a quarter of all marine species is no longer functioning. So it's really a serious systemic concern for the oceans as a whole. And we do know that because of climate change, we're getting increased coral bleaching and globally a decrease in hard coral cover. And you can see this, these are global numbers on this plot here, and they're the best numbers we have right now, and they go through 2020. And you can see the first coral bleaching event in 1998, the first global reef bleaching event. And you can see that after that, the reefs kind of recovered, they popped back up. But then since 2010, we've had more bleaching that's been more frequent and more severe, so that the reefs globally, their natural ability to recover has not been strong enough to overcome the increasing stress caused by climate change. I do, however, want to complicate this picture a little bit, and this will be a theme of this presentation, is complicating the picture. If you break that trend out by region, these are the same numbers, you see different things. So if you look at that plot in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, that's the Western Indian Ocean. That's the region that we'll be talking about today. You actually see that since the 1980s, there's a slight increase in coral cover. So they were certainly affected by the 1998 bleaching event. They were affected by bleaching in 2010. But right now, bleaching is not the most important concern. It depends on where you are. It depends on environmental conditions. It depends on what species of coral dominate your reefs. So it is a global concern. It is a big problem, but it's complicated. It's context specific. A second really big concern faced by coral reefs also has to do with the heating of the world's oceans. We just had a record year for Earth surface temperatures in 2023. We are still breaking records for ocean surface temperatures, which started in 2023 and is continuing now. We don't even really know why. Climate scientists are not sure about what's going on there. And one of the things that tropical communities are really vulnerable to when sea temperatures increase is fish migration. So the fish that live in the tropics often live really close to their upper thermal energy limit. So they're in, basically the water's about as warm as many of those species can take. And that's what this plot is trying to show. It's from a study of Indonesia, Japan, and Southeast Australia. And is one of many studies that's documented this poleward migration of fish species. So basically, as the water is warm in the tropics, those tropical fish either move north or south, really anywhere they could find cooler water that's more in line with their temperature preferences, their dietary preferences. And what that means for the tropics is that they're losing both the number of species available and their total fish catches available. That's really, we are beginning to see that happen. That is not the biggest impact on fish catches right now. I'll talk about that in 1 second. But this is a really important kind of medium to longer term concern for climate change and tropical fisheries, including coral reef fisheries. The final kind of big global threat I want to just flag for you before we dive into some of this more context specific stuff is overfishing. So this is a map of the area that most of my research has taken place in, which is the Western Indian Ocean, just like it sounds, literally, western half of the Indian Ocean. And so that's dominated population-wise by East Africa and Madagascar. And East Africa has this really large fringing coral reef that goes from southern Somalia really down to northern Mozambique, but you do find coral south of that. And this is a big study done by a colleague of mine, and they mapped every coral reef in the Western Indian Ocean. And we use that map in our research later on, so you'll see some of that. And they classified each of those coral reefs in accordance with the amount of fishing going on. And you can see there's a lot of red on this map, and all of those red dots are overfished coral reefs, which makes the reefs themselves more susceptible to climate change. They're less resilient. It also means that the people fishing those reefs make less money. It means they produce less fish, and that means there's less nutritious fresh food available in these food insecure coastal communities. There are a lot of reasons why overfishing happens, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. That's not really the topic of the talk. I'm happy to discuss it. But I do want to make clear that really we can think of this as structural overfishing. It's not that local communities need to be taking better care of their resources, although there is a lot of space for local action, and there are certainly some really good success stories, especially if you look at where those blue dots are, where sustainable fishing is taking place. But really, it's enmeshed with very significant social, political, economic dynamics that from every level to local to global. But the point I want you to take away is that this third threat of overfishing is really very significant, particularly in the Western Indian Ocean, but that's true for fished coral reefs globally. Now that I've kind of flagged these global concerns, it's really important to have them in the back of our heads. So we have bleaching, we have the migration of fish as temperatures increase, and then we also have overfishing. And all of these things kind of conspire to impact coral reefs. I want to really talk about, though, what this is like for people and for communities on the ground. And so rather than tell you at first, I will tell you, don't worry. But rather than begin with that, I'd like to let some folks from some of these communities speak for themselves. And so I'm going to show you a video right now of some interviews that we did in Malindi, which is on the coast of Kenya. And please, someone let me know if this isn't working in some way.
I depend on the fish to get my daily bread. I have ventured into this frying fish business for 25 years. All my life, I have been doing the same thing. I have no other source of income. Our government does not give us any assistance. That thing really hurts me so much. What I need is to get some assistance in my life so that I'm able to care for my children. I get business capital to live a good life, buy fish without debts in all seasons. Otherwise, without that, my life is destroyed completely.
Recently, we have been having quite a big challenge in the issue of environment. The weather has been unpredictable. We are not able to understand when the changes of the wind or current of the sea would be. So our fishermen are really getting a hard time going out fishing.
Daily in our fishing activities, we encounter so many challenges, especially when the tides are high. Sometimes, because we lack proper fishing equipment, fishermen drown in the ocean, and in low seasons, we face challenges because it's difficult to catch fish.
Due to years of overfishing to support the nutrition and income needs of a rapidly growing region, Indian Ocean fish populations have drastically decreased. Many Kenyan fishers rely on species that live on coral reefs and in seagrass lagoons. Others target large migratory species like tuna. But most areas of the coast are overfished, and some have sought to maintain yields by catching smaller juvenile fish, a practice which compromises sustainability and food security for the future. To address overfishing of young fish, the Kenyan government outlawed certain high-yield nets, but the law was passed with minimal consultation of local fishers.
There are some rules that are made by people from other states that there are nets that are not appropriate for fishing. These are the nets that enable us to catch a good number of fish. When you are spotted with these nets, you get arrested. But these are the nets that make us catch so many fish. The nets made from clothing don't catch fish at all.
While banning these nets was an important step for fishery conservation, it has also caused frustration among fishermen caught in this cycle of overfishing. At the same time, the changing climate has made fishing a more dangerous profession.
So our fishermen right now, when they go out fishing, they go out prepared for anything. When rough winds comes up, there's a possibility of fishermen overturning in the seas.
As fishing becomes riskier due to climate change, industry costs have risen, placing financial burdens on fishers. Modern, weather-safe fishing gear costs more money. Longer trips and rough conditions require more fuel. As a result, fishermen are taking out loans to finance their operations. But few loan recipients have financial management training. The combination of rising equipment costs and dwindling fish populations has caused a sharp increase in the price of fish. Many women who work as fish fryers don't have enough capital or savings to buy fish outright, so they buy on credit. If they don't make enough to pay the fishermen back, they become trapped in a cycle of debt.
When they sell their fish to us, and our capital is very minimal, we buy the fish from them as a debt. When we get the fish from them, we fry and sell. We sell the fish and pay the loan, but we pay it in half and they give us another debt of fish. I cannot afford to pay the debt. So I think of a solution. I go to his house, get intimate with him so that he pardons me the debt. But if I had capital, this whole thing would not have happened. I would have bought the fish in cash, but because I am poor, this has to happen.
Okay. Oh, hold on. Okay. So thank you for just spending a minute to listen to that. One of the things for me that jumps out when I listen to those stories from Malindi is that all of those global issues that we talked about before, coral bleaching, outmigration of fish, overfishing, they come up. It's not that they're not relevant, but they're not the first thing people talk about. And they're always enmeshed in just the kind of struggles of everyday life. So you can't talk about overfishing without talking about whether there are financial services available that are socially that are permissible under Islam, right? So the Kenyan coast is a Muslim area. You can't talk about it without talking about corruption in the government, or without talking about the way in which fisheries are managed. And that these are kind of things that I began to encounter for the first time really shortly after I landed in Kenya, because I knew when I got there that, I'm going to live in Nairobi and I'm going to be working in this continent-wide network. But I knew that it was really unacceptable for me to do my research or do my advocacy based on that, only on that global or top-down view, that I had to go and begin by listening to those communities. And one of the communities I worked most closely with was not actually Malindi, but was Lamu up in the north on the border with Somalia. And similarly, I'll show you just a couple pictures so you get a sense of what it's like. Lamu is an incredible place that I'd love to talk about more, but it's a traditional community. It's a World Heritage Site. It's the oldest continuously inhabited Swahili settlement in East Africa. It's really an incredible place. And they're also similarly facing lots of threats, including from the war on terror and armed conflict, and from maldevelopment, basically just poor planning by the government and corruption as well. And so when I went there, people shared similar concerns to what you just heard in this video from Melindy. Top-down regulation, the government's taking our fishing nets, they never consulted us, and all of these other challenges. One of the specific issues at Lamu is this building of this really giant megaport project that is intended to have 33 berths for cargo ships. And in building this project, they destroyed the bay that it's in, so the bay that these people rely on. So on top of all of the things you just heard about going on in Malindi, they're also now contending with reefs that have been reduced to rubble, not by climate change, but by this construction project, by being displaced from their fishing grounds, and kind of all of the challenges that follow that. So 2 different places on the Kenyan coast, 2 very different realities, but the similar threads here are just the complexity of what's going on. And I hope, not because I want you to have an unpleasant experience, but I hope that you in some way are feeling a little bit overwhelmed at this point. Because that's appropriate. We are looking at this global planetary crisis, and there is really no way as one person to even get an intellectual handle on its complexity, right? We just looked at 2 really specific locations. We only scratched the surface. We're only talking about coral reef fisheries. This is really complex. And so it raises this question of what do we do? And I also want to be very clear, we don't always need to jump right to what do we do. Often we need to spend time in that complexity, spend time feeling overwhelmed, and let that be a reality for us. But I want to provide you with a constructive response. And really that constructive response is integral ecology. Again, that framework proposed to us by Pope Francis. And I want to pivot now that we've kind of done this first part of looking and listening to talking about integral ecology. And again, I'll share in a bit about my own research. So this is a figure from a briefing note I wrote with a colleague at the Laudato Si Research Institute, which is at Campion Hall, which is the Jesuit college at Oxford. Our briefing note was really on putting integral ecology into practice. And for us, the core of putting integral ecology into practice are these 4 lenses. So these 4 ways of seeing the world. And each lens we have to use individually, but they also have to intersect with each other. You can also think of these as 4 pillars of integral ecology, or as 4 legs on a table around which we can have conversation. And the first 2 lenses are what we just did for the first part of this presentation. The first is to listen to the cry of the excluded. So those people who are marginalized in any way. And the second is to listen and respond to the cry of the earth, or in our case, the cry of the sea. So connecting with the lands and the waters that mother us, that are our mother planet, and getting in touch with ecological suffering. So marginalized people and marginalized ecosystems. And we begin with those realities. Again, we just did it. You were already doing integral ecology and you had no idea this whole time. Or maybe you did know, maybe you knew where I was going. I don't want to assume that. Anyway, lens number 3, everything is interconnected. Pope Francis says, I cannot stress enough, I cannot say too much how everything is interconnected. So you have to bring this intersectional analysis that sees complexity, that goes from that global map of coral reef cover that's decreasing to those regional maps that says, well, actually, there are different patterns here that add up to decreasing, but are also really context specific, that go from this, narrative that's focused just on coral reefs and climate change to becoming focused on the communities that rely on coral reefs and are affected by climate change and are confronting these realities on a daily basis in a way that's enmeshed with their other political and economic and social structures. And finally, everything moving towards ecological conversion. And I want to be very clear about what I mean by that. really has two meanings. So we can think of it as a conversion of hearts and minds, and I think that's kind of the most common meaning of ecological conversion. That is most of what Pope Francis talks about when he talks about ecological conversion in Laudato Si. That's not the meaning I'm most interested in. Francis also says in Laudato Si that ecological conversion is a community conversion. So it's not just about me as I stand before God, it's about all of us as members of an ecosystem, a global ecosystem that includes human and non-human relationships. And what we're talking about is transforming that global human and non-human ecosystem, converting it for the good. We're really talking about what, in religious terms, this is the kingdom of God. So social and ecological justice, a concrete, systemic, transformative response to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. That's what we mean by ecological conversion. And that's the goal of applying the integral ecology framework, putting integral ecology into practice. I am going to just kind of briefly look at this. I don't want to spend too much time here because we have to talk about fish still. We haven't even got to the fish. But these are just some keywords that go with the technocratic paradigm and integral ecology. Technocratic paradigm is really, Pope Francis proposes integral ecology as an alternative to or a response to the technocratic paradigm, which for him are the, quote, human roots of the ecological crisis that's caused the problem. And these numbers here are paragraph numbers from Laudato Si if you'd like to kind of follow up on this later. So ecological conversion is our goal that moves us from the technocratic paradigm to really living an integral ecology. So how do we put this into practice? I can't answer that for you. Like I said, this is really context specific. So it's important to look at is the model and how we can use the model. And how I've used the model is by looking at, as an ecologist, but looking at marine fisheries that rely on these coral reefs from this nutritional perspective. So looking at both the ecological function and kind of social public health functions of these fisheries. And I have a little warning there. It's important. Prepare for some sciencey things. So if you're into science, this is great. And if you're not into science, guess it's still gonna be great, but you gotta buckle up and be prepared for some graphs and numbers and such. So a really important kind of initial note is that fish are not equally nutritious. And this is one of those like complexifying pieces of that third lens of integral ecology that we have to pay attention to, the lens of seeing that everything's interconnected. This stuff is complicated. We often think from a dietary perspective about like, beef is in one category, chicken's in another category, fish is in another category. But as it turns out, that fish category is just incredibly diverse. And so one really cool thing that's happened in recent years is we've had some very powerful tools become available that let us estimate the nutrient density of specific species of fish. And so you can do cool things like what we did here on the right of comparing the nutrient density of fish catches by looking at the species in those catches. That's what we did for these 10 jurisdictions in the Western Indian Ocean, and just for the coral reef fisheries to say, well, what's the nutrition that coral reefs are producing? So always basing it on what's happening in a specific place, in specific habitats, and always seeing the connection between, in this case, the ecosystem and nutrient production. And kind of following this context-specific emphasis, the very first thing we did was not a big global fancy study of nutrient yields of fisheries at the global level. There are some people who have done things like that, and it's actually really wonderful and valuable work. But we started, instead of top down, we started bottom up, and we went right to a very specific context and looked at this fishing gear. So these fish traps that you see in that picture on the right. And these traps are used along the Kenyan coast and other parts of the Western Indian Ocean. Basically that, they're really good for fishers because you can set them in the coral lagoons, so they're easy to access. They keep your catch alive and fresh. So you have a high quality, high value catch to sell when you get back to shore. And they're pretty easy to use. So they can be a popular gear, especially for poorer fishers. And there's been some work done on these traps to put an escape gap in them for undersized fish. So it's basically just a hole that's just big enough to let small baby fish escape. And what that does, it allows those fish to grow up and lead nice flourishing lives, basically, and reproduce before they're caught, which allows for the sustainability of the fishery. And you can see from this plot on the left, we had about 10 years of data on these traps. The gated traps in yellow are skewing longer. So the fish they're capturing are larger than the traditional traps in green on the left of that plot, which basically just says these traps work. They capture larger fish. A problem with this, or a potential problem with this, that we wanted to look at from a nutrition perspective is that often small fish are recommended as being more nutritionally valuable. And there are two reasons for this. One is that people often eat them whole. So you're eating bones and you're eating innards, which are much more nutrient dense than just like a regular fillet you would get at a grocery store, for instance. The other reason is that there's a thought that some small species are more nutritionally valuable. So we had this potential trade-off between sustainability and nutrition. And we were really kind of pleasantly surprised to find that in this case, in this specific fishery with a specific gear modification, sustainability and nutrition are actually aligned. So what you see on the x-axis of these plots is a measure of sustainability. You really want that to be sitting at about 1. And if you look at those top 3 nutrients, calcium, iron, and omega-3, the green line shows you the production of those nutrients in the regular traps, and the yellow is the modified traps that have those escape gaps, that those modified traps are producing more, and that their nutrient production peaks right around that 1, which means that you're able to achieve both of these objectives. You're not seeing these really strong trade-offs between nutrition and sustainability that we thought we might find in the system. Once we did that and we saw this kind of contradiction between this global idea, this global recommendation, and what's actually happening on the ground in specific coral reef fisheries, we wanted to kind of look at these global recommendations specifically for coral reef fisheries of the Western Indian Ocean, so we can provide meaningful information to the communities that rely on these coral reefs and also to the people managing them. And so we took these global recommendations from a nutrition perspective that might conflict with recommendations from a traditional management perspective. So one recommendation would be, from a nutrition perspective, maybe capturing more species, a more biodiverse catch would also mean you're capturing more nutrients. You'll have a more nutritionally diverse catch. And that's been found in some places. All of these have been found in some places or at the global level. The traditional recommendation is kind of not specific there. There's not a general recommendation on the number of species you want to catch to be sustainable. The second recommendation we looked at was whether there are specific species you want to target that are more nutritious rather than targeting more economically valuable species, which is the normal kind of approach. And then finally, this question of small fishes, which you heard mentioned in the video from Melindy, which you heard just now in the traps question of whether the small fishes were really more nutrient dense or not. And we wanted to look at that. We found no relationship between the number of species and the nutrient density of the catch. It's just not there for coral reef fisheries. We found the second one is really more of a value question, so there's not a lot that you can kind of analyze to answer. You just have to decide what you want to do, and that we're working in a mixed species fishery anyway. So kind of, if you're targeting a specific species, you're really changing the fishery. And we did not find enough variance in the nutrient density of our fish species to justify that. And then finally, we wanted to look at this question of small fishes, which actually got really interesting. So this plot on the left is this is data from 3 countries. This is Kenya, Mozambique, and Madagascar. And you can see that we did actually find a relationship between size and nutrient density. So when fishers in those 3 countries captured smaller fishes, the mean length of their catch was lower off of those coral reefs. They had a slightly increased nutrient density. But that increase turns out to be quite small relative to human nutritional requirements. So on the left there, that plot, that actual axis is out of 600% for the daily requirement of the 6 nutrients we're looking at: calcium, iron, omega-3, selenium, vitamin A, and zinc. On the right, you can see those relationships broken down for specific nutrients by length, and that's just for Kenyan fisheries. And you see there are some relationships, but it varies by nutrient. So smaller fish do not have more selenium, for instance. There is no relationship between length and vitamin A. And even where smaller fish are more nutrient dense in the case of calcium and iron and zinc, those differences are quite small relative to the actual nutritional requirement of humans. And here we're looking at children aged 1 to 3. So those horizontal lines on those plots are the daily requirement. For plots, the first 2 plots, calcium and iron, we didn't put those lines on because if we did that, they're so far off the plot, you wouldn't be able to see any of the relationships, which just tells you kind of further how small this relationship is compared to human nutritional requirements. So you have this trend that's being talked about at the global level, that's being recommended in global policy, and then we take this down to the specific context of the ecosystem. We find out, well, actually, this policy advice really would not achieve very much in terms of increasing nutrition. It would, however, achieve quite a bit in terms of undermining sustainability. And we looked at that as well. So we found here, this is just a measure of your production kilograms per fisher per day. And you can see larger fish, you get more production, you get more yield. Larger fish, you get more nutrients produced, you get a higher nutrient yield. And finally, larger fish, you get a more sexually mature catch. So this is another measure of sustainability. So more production, more sustainability, not a huge increase in nutrients. So we can pretty safely say that this was a poor recommendation. And it's an example of this technocratic approach being used where you have this top-down method, you're valuing only certain kinds of knowledge, and you're going to make policy recommendations based on that, where we could counter that by going context specific, modeling, really as extensively as we could to get a handle on what would actually be helpful for these communities. So I hope we can see how these lenses applied, how I put them into practice. That first question there, the how did I do, I'm actually a little bit less interested in because I know like my answer for that is far from perfect. Like I did okay, we did some integral ecology things. There's a lot more work to be done. But my real question for you is how might you put these 4 lenses into practice in your own work as educators or whatever else you're doing? I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bryan. I'll kick off. We do have some time for Q&A and feedback with Bryan, which we're grateful for. I'll get us started. Bryan, I really value how you are able to take something so massive, like a global planetary crisis, and make it really come to life, come alive through your work, particularly in sharing what it's like for people on the ground. And the same with the idea of putting integral ecology into practice, these big ideas. Now, I imagine that your presentation, that many teachers and faculty members, science teachers or service directors, campus ministers, mission folks around our schools will use this recording and of this session and share it with their students. As a way of doing just that. Can you, speaking to students for just a moment, can you share a bit about what initially for you sparked your interest in this? I'm always curious about where passions begin. What was it for you?
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. That's a great question. So for me, this is really the coming together of many different interests. I grew up in Rhode Island on the ocean. Literally the high tide line was our property line. And so really from a young age, as long as I can remember, I felt very connected to the ocean as an important ecosystem, as a place where I encountered God. And that was really kind of the birth of a lot of this. When I was graduating from college, I did my undergrad at Fordham, and I double majored in biology and theology. That I really, I had seen the impacts of this crisis, the planetary crisis, studying abroad in South Africa. And I had seen it through my classes, through my biology classes, and I knew I wanted to do something about it. And so this became kind of a concrete way to respond to the crisis, to do ecology work that's also social justice work, and to do so in a way that was faithful to my own relationship to God and my relationship to the planet, which really started with and is still kind of centered around oceans. So really kind of fisheries and coral reefs and climate change all became kind of flowed naturally from those things.
Thank you. And if folks on the call here, you can just chime in, please. No reason to raise your hand. Just jump in with a few remaining minutes we've got with Bryan.
I'll jump in. If at first, I just want to say that was one of the most beautiful, visually beautiful presentations. The images, I know some of them are harsh, but just it was very impactful in content and in also in the way you gave it. And I think that's very important. And it brings me to really what my question is, because I love, and I'm still processing, and I saw you in when you were back east, but it's so important, the layers and the complexity. Like, I think that is really at the core. And my question is, are there resources? I'm like taking screenshots as I'm watching to just try and, give myself time to process. But are there some resources? Because this can really apply across everything we do. Nothing is that simple and straightforward. And would you, if yes, would you share some kind of educator or administrator-based resources that we could access that would just kind of give us some more scaffolding in how do we approach something, looking at the layers and the details?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I appreciate the kind of emphasis on complexity and how you get a handle on that. In terms of ways to take that forward, there are a couple of resources that I know of. So, and one of these you probably at least know of already, which is the work that's been done by the International Jesuit Ecology Project at Loyola Chicago. They have great textbooks and resources for classroom teaching that do a similar thing. They look at this planetary crisis, but they use this integral ecology framework, which necessarily means that you're going local, you're looking at complexity, and you're looking at how these systems at all levels, right, not just global and local, but there's a heck of a lot in between those two things, interact. Another resource that I'll recommend is the one that I brought that figure out from, the briefing note that I put together with my colleague at the Laudato Si Research Institute, and I can share that with Kristen to share with everyone afterwards. Maybe we can link to it in a description or something, which is where that kind of four lens framework comes from. And for me, that's like the most versatile and helpful way to get a handle on this. Integral ecology is really easy to like silo and to say, you're the, I experience this personally, like, oh, you're the integral ecology person, you'll take care of it, and we'll do something else over here. When in fact, as you point out, like, no, this is really everything. People, there are literally Catholic organizations that will have a section for integral ecology and a section for integral human development, when really integral human development is part of integral ecology, if we're thinking about how everything fits together properly.
Thank you. And are you referring is it Healing Earth?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Bryan, thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. Something that really struck me was when you were kind of giving us the initial information, and there was a moment where you were like, okay, if you're overwhelmed now, you should be, but here's how, like, we're going to move past it and this is what we're going to do. Specifically, I'm thinking a lot about like students who might be learning about things like this for the first time, more so like teenagers. Do you have any either recommendations or practices or things that you personally do to kind of like move past that overwhelmness, or like after, you kind of sit in that discomfort and you sit with it a bit, what could potentially help like lead to process, and specifically for like students who might be learning about this for the first time?
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that. I think feeling overwhelmed is actually a really important part of the process, and you just named something that's really important, which is to sit in the discomfort. And the question, once you're doing that, I think, is, are you going to sit in the discomfort and just focus on the discomfort? Or is there something that can bring your eyes up to look kind of beyond the horizon? So for me, that is Ignatian spirituality and my relationship with God. So I believe and have bet my life on this reality that God is working for literally for ecological conversion, right? God is working to bring about the kingdom of God on earth, which we understand as the transformation of social and ecological systems as they currently are. And that's a mystery. Sometimes you can identify places where that's happening, and sometimes it feels like we're not making any progress. But I have this faith in that God and can encounter that God in prayer and in discernment and in my life. And that for me is really a cause for hope. Another really important thing that is not necessarily faith dependent is just relationships. So integral ecology, we talked about everything is interconnected, right? We're part of human and non-human ecologies. And that means that we're in relationship. And I think it's really important and effective and helpful to ground ourselves in those relationships. And sometimes relationships will actually draw us to be more overwhelmed. So like my relationships with community leaders in Lamu, Kenya, forced me to be in touch with and to confront very hard and difficult realities. And it also helped me to see how people are already resilient and already confronting a crisis that they didn't cause, that they had no hand in making happen. So that relationship can be challenging, but it also provides opportunities for hope, for mutual support, and for solidarity in the face of these things that are just really challenging.
Thank you.
Bryan, I have two questions that are on my mind. I also want to thank you for your presentation and just the level of intentionality that you gave. My first question would be, you mentioned the framework. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, how can we make that framework sustainable, especially with all the different like risks and possibilities for corruption? So my question would be, how do you suggest tackling that? And then my second question, you've already kind of touched on this a little bit, given with the previous question, but I'm just curious about how your identity as a Jesuit and how your Jesuit spirituality further informs that call or that impact for action.
Yeah, thanks. Can I ask kind of specifically what do you mean, or what do you think of when you talk about? I assume the framework is the integral ecology four lenses thing, but what are the kind of risks that you're seeing or that you're specifically concerned about?
It's not so much concern. I guess I'm just really curious about like how to implement that framework. And then also kind of like how to continue following that framework, especially in more impoverished countries where that temptation for exploitation could very easily undermine, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so it is it's a tall order to respond in any constructive way that really takes the kind of breadth and depth of the planetary crisis into account. And that includes implementing integral ecology or putting it into practice. So I'm really hesitant to provide like a series of instructional steps or a cookbook recipe because of the complexity and the context specificity. So it's really more intended as like a very flexible and adaptable way of knowing and interacting with the world, and even as something that hopefully kind of becomes intuitive and you don't need to notice that you're doing it all of the time. So in many kinds of ministry, without naming, oh well, I'm going to do lenses 1 and 2, listen to the cry of the earth and the poor, you may be already noticing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor in your particular context and with the people you're working with and in the place you're working or in the place you're living and praying and being in relationship. So I think that kind of flexibility and context specificity is just important to keep an eye on. And I am going to use it to dodge that piece of your question. If you want to know like more specifically about how that can be done for research, that's really the topic of the briefing note. And so we point to transdisciplinarity as an ideal, so breaking down disciplinary silos and not even using traditional academic knowledge as the arbiter of what is true. And that's kind of complicated. I don't do it very well. And I participate in the transdisciplinarity. I'm still kind of rooted disciplinarily, which I think is important for me. But that is kind of one way to put that into practice. For me, so kind of moving to your question about the ambiguities and the challenges, it really, in my experience, using integral ecology or using that framework worked kind of naturally with the people I was encountering. It felt right to say, what are your needs and what are your priorities and how can I help and where do I fit into that? It felt right and natural to do my best, limited as I am, to see the complexity and the intersectionality of what people were sharing with me and what they were experiencing. So there is always a risk of corruption and a risk of failure. And honestly, I think when I confront the scale of the crisis, I'm no longer so interested. Well, I would love to succeed and to solve the problem, but I'm also willing to fail well. We're in Holy Week. Jesus's crucifixion was initially seen as a failure, right? And that's how God works. So I do not hope that everything ends in catastrophic failure, but I do believe that there's a lot of value in simply doing the best we can and engaging in the way that we know to be most just. I know that's like a really insufficient answer, but it's a great question.
No, thank you. I appreciate your response.
No, it's a big answer for a big question, right? Thank you. Thank you to everyone. And thank you, Brenna, for the articles you shared. I was going to say the same thing, that it reminded me of the IPP. So I appreciate that in the article that you shared on change makers as well. We are grateful for everyone spending an hour with us here this afternoon. I thank Bryan for sharing his meaningful work and allowing us a glimpse into it, allowing us to leave feeling like we have learned something and also like there is so much more to learn. So thank you for that. We will work on having the recording of this session available, probably will be after Easter. And we would be most grateful if you might share it around your communities and your circles. Again, I think having experienced it this afternoon, there are so many folks around our schools who would benefit from learning from Bryan's work. So thank you for it. Wishing everyone a happy Easter and rest of the Holy Week as well. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you.